Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. I'm David Geiger, your host. I've been on Iowa TV and radio for the last decade, and I am excited to join you on this podcast, Farm Here Daily. Today on the program, we're going to dive into some of the legal aspects of the big, beautiful bill with Christine Tidgren of the Iowa State University Center for Ag Law and Taxation. Please be sure to like and follow the program as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, making sure folks in Iowa are informed about what's affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining us on Farm Here Daily, we're going to talk about tax provisions with Christine Tidgren, the director of the Iowa State University Center for Ag Law and Taxation. Christine, I'm always happy to talk to you. Always good information comes from you. And also your blogs that you guys post on there pretty regularly. And that's why I'm calling, because a recent post you guys had was, what are the tax provisions in the House's big, beautiful bill? We're going to go over that. First off, Christine, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, David. Yes, there are a lot of tax provisions in this big, beautiful bill, so we'll have quite a bit to talk about.
Let's jump right in there then, because this was a very tightly passed bill from the House, 215 to 214. What would you say is the largest takeaway for our farmers here in Iowa from that bill?
Well, I would say that there is a lot of information in this bill that we need to pay attention to that would deal with our tax rates, some deductions that are available right now that are going away, but the bill would extend them. So we'll talk through all of those. But one thing I want to make clear today is that we don't really know what the ultimate legislation will look like, whether it will actually get passed. And if it is passed all the way through the Senate and signed by the president, it will look different than this particular bill looks. So everyone just needs to be aware that this is sort of the opening salvo, the bid to say, here's what the House could get through. Now it's in the hands of the Senate. Now it's very difficult because with only one vote to spare in the House, the Senate really can't change too many things, or we may have troubles when it comes back to the House. They may have a hard time getting that passed back through the House. So it's a very interesting political process that we're all watching to see what will happen.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up because there's already concerns. There's several senators on the Republican side that are worried about X or Y things. And so there's going to be some changes made. Whether the House responds well to that or not will definitely be up in the air. In terms of what the House did send them, though, I had a lot of notes on things that were already there and therefore extended versus new things. So what would be kind of some new items when it comes to taxation within this bill?
Well, before we go into the new items, I would like to just clarify so everybody understands why 2025 is a big year for taxes. And that's because if you think all the way back to the end of 2017, we had a big tax bill called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that passed the Republican-led Congress at that time and really significantly changed the tax code. Really, we've said, and it's borne true, that it changed the tax code more than it had been changed in 30 years prior to that. So very significant changes were made then. Because of the way the bill was passed through the reconciliation process, which is also the way this particular bill would have to be passed as well, it could not affect the budget for more than 10 years. So some of the provisions, many of the provisions that were part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were left to expire at the end of 2025. That's why as we sit here today in June of 2025, many of the provisions that we've come to be used to, lower tax rates, 199A deduction. Again, we'll talk in more detail about these provisions in a minute. They are all set to go away altogether. So when we say, well, we're just extending provisions that are here, they're sort of really a big deal because we've kind of grown used to them. However, they are all set to go away and go back to the way that they were. So every single one of those extensions, though, is going to cost money. So it's sort of a lot of things in this bill. But as far as brand new provisions, I would say there are fewer new provisions that we've never seen before that apply specifically to farmers than just apply generally across the board to Americans as a whole. So some of the provisions really don't even apply to agriculture very much at all. Some of the brand new provisions that are in this bill would include not taxing tip income. If you're a waitress, if you're a hairdresser, you wouldn't have a tax on your tips. Deduction for qualified overtime compensation. In most cases, our agricultural laborers, our agricultural producers are not eligible for overtime. It's just the way that the Fair Labor Standards Act works. So that one wouldn't significantly impact agriculture. There is an interesting provision in here that would allow you to take a deduction for interest that you pay to buy a personal use car. So again, not anything related to your business, your agricultural business, but you need a car to drive around. And this provision would allow you to take up to a $10,000 a year deduction for the interest associated with that car loan. So that would definitely be something brand new that we haven't had before. There's some other provisions in there too. One of note would be a new savings account option for children, interestingly called Trump accounts. The federal government would actually give a starter contribution to this of $1,000, and then the savings account would grow tax-free over time. And then when the person turned 18, they could pull some money out for education, a first home, that type of thing. They would have to pay tax when they took it out, but it would have been able to grow tax-free all the time during their growing up years. So those are some of the new provisions that are sort of novel that we've not seen before. Most of the other ones, although there are a few other new ones as well, but most of the other provisions are just extensions and then modifications. So not everything that would be extended by the House bill would be extended exactly the same as it is today. So we could talk about some of those modifications as well.
Absolutely. Let's go right into some of those modifications. Is there one in particular that you think stands out from all of the provisions within the bill?
Well, one provision of interest that I think is important to agricultural producers because they've really become, I'd say, dependent on the 199A deduction. And this was a brand new deduction that was put in place back in 2018 for pass-through businesses or sole proprietorships. So if you remember the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it significantly lowered the corporate income tax rate from 35% down to 21% permanently. And that was a big change if you were in a corporation. But if you weren't in a corporation, which most of our farming businesses are not corporations, then you didn't have that permanent tax rate decrease. Instead, what Congress gave us was a 20% deduction for qualified business income. So your farm income, if you had $100,000 of farm income, what the QBI deduction allowed you to do is pay tax on only $80,000 of that. So a 20% deduction, pretty significant. The only problem with that was that when that was put in place in 2018, it wasn't permanent. Again, for cost reasons, they had to put some limits on things. So this is one of those provisions that is set to expire expire at the end of 2025. Now, what the House has done in the big, beautiful bill is say, okay, we are going to not only extend this permanently, so it would extend the QBI deduction permanently, but we will also increase it to 23%. So instead of a 20% deduction, it would be a 23% deduction starting in 2026, and there would not be an expiration for that QBI deduction. So that, I think, would be viewed favorably by most farmers just because it would be helpful to their bottom line.
Another movement on this that kind of is on the modification side of things, I believe, is ag loans. Is there some interest changes there?
Yeah, and it's an interesting provision where it's sort of intended to equalize the playing field, I guess, for ag lenders, so that everybody's sort of treated a little bit more the same. So what this would allow is standard state federally regulated banks, bank holding companies and things, if they are giving loans for ag related property, they would be able to exclude from their gross income 25% of the interest income that they get from those loans. And again, this one is really intended to sort of put some ag banks on the same level as Farm Credit. So again, we don't know how this will play out in the Senate, but the House version calls for a 25% exclusion from income for these banks.
Christine, as we look at these tax extensions, historically, they've been around for now 7 years. How important are they to our farmers?
Well, I think they're very important because our farm community, like all other businesses, have come to depend on them. For example, the 199A deduction, when they're kind of determining their cash flow, their bottom line, that's sort of how they have become used to calculating their income by considering that they'll get this deduction on the tax end and have less tax liability. So, it's something that once you sort of become reliant on a particular tax system, then it's kind of hard to change things because you have to make up for it somewhere else. So that money has to come from somewhere else to pay the extra tax. So one of the big provisions that is just basic, but it is a very important provision in this bill that would be an extension, is extending the lower tax rates as a whole. So we talked about the deduction for business income, but just every taxpayer in America received a lower tax rate, or most taxpayers in America received a lower tax rate in terms of what they were required to pay under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And if that does not get extended, a lot of people would see a tax increase because of those increased rates. And so I do want people to kind of understand a little bit about the impact of the increase in rates, because it's not just the fact that, well, right now the top income tax rate is 37%. And if the expiration occurs, then in 2026, the top income tax rate would be 39.6. I mean, that's significant, but more significant than that, all of these rate changes, for example, going from a 28% rate to a 33% rate, et cetera, they were coupled with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act increased the income threshold at which you reached the higher rate. So just as an example, if we're just looking at the highest income tax rate, which you could pick almost any tax bracket and it would apply, but it's easy to pick the top one. And in 2026, you would be, if the extension does not occur, you would be liable for the top tax rate of 39.6% as a single person if you made $543,000 of income. Under the extension, you would have a top tax rate of 37%, but you wouldn't reach that top rate until you had $639,000 of income. So, you can take that down to somebody that makes $119,000 and you'd have a similar thing where you are going to be reaching a higher tax rate at a lower income level if indeed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provision expires. So the extension would continue that lower tax rate for higher income generally moving forward.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Business. How can you free up your team from time-consuming office tasks? Amazon Business empowers leaders to not only streamline purchasing, but better support their teams so they can focus on strategy and growth. Free up your teams and focus on your future. Learn more about the technology, insights, and support available at amazonbusiness.com.
Christine, one of the more negative sides that might affect our farmers, and like we said before, this isn't set in stone. This is just the House version. The Senate has to go through it. But there were some cuts made to conservation and renewable energy projects. Would any of that affect our rural farmers, our rural side of the community?
Yes, and again, I would say we just don't know exactly what will end up in a final bill if it indeed the legislation gets passed. But the House ended up overnight, the night before they passed it, with a manager's amendment that significantly restricted a couple of provisions that some of our farmers do rely on. And those are farmers who maybe put solar panels on a hog barn or put small wind on their farm to help generate electricity for their livestock operation, something like that. We have quite a few farmers who have taken advantage of some credits. Clean electricity credits is kind of what they're called. And initially, those were going to be phased out a little bit earlier, but in the manager's amendment, they were phased out very, very quickly to say that if this gets passed, if you haven't started construction on one of those particular items within 60 days after the passage of the bill, then you would not be eligible for the tax credit. So some of these credits were really enhanced and made available through the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. But some of those credits have been in effect way long before that. For example, if I wanted to put solar on my hog barn, I've been eligible for an investment tax credit way before the Inflation Reduction Act was in effect. And essentially, that was a 30% credit that really made it possible for me to do that. And again, this version of the big, beautiful bill that passed the House completely would eliminate that, which would be a big change. Now, one thing that's interesting is it did not eliminate a couple of other credits that have become sort of well-known in agricultural circles and in agricultural publications. One of those is the clean fuels credit, which would be available to things like ethanol plants who are creating clean fuel. It would actually not be restricted or ended early. The only restriction that would be put on that would be the transferability of the credit to someone else would be phased out earlier than what was originally there under the Inflation Reduction Act. But under this House bill, ethanol plants would still be eligible for a clean fuels credit. And that is something that a lot of farmers have been interested in thinking about. If they grow their grain in a particular way with a particular practice, if they could get a premium price from an ethanol plant, for example, for purchasing it, if it would lower the carbon intensity score of the fuel that's created by that plant. And so there's been a lot of discussion on that. We had some preliminary regulations that came out from IRS relying on USDA, but we have nothing finalized there. So we don't know exactly how farmers could benefit from that, but so far the big, beautiful bill would continue to allow that clean fuel credit. Another credit that is sort of available right now that has resulted in somewhat of a controversial situation here in Iowa, I know, among farmers, is the carbon sequestration credit. That one too has not been restricted except for transferability of the credit to other people. But otherwise, that credit would continue in effect as well. And of course, that is the credit that would be available for the creation of a carbon sequestration pipeline, the whole Summit project. And of course, the reason I mentioned that there's some controversy going on is on one hand, we have agricultural producers who are really, really excited about sequestering carbon to lower the carbon emissions of the creation of renewable fuels from, for example, corn, and thinking that that will open new markets up for our corn, for example. And then there are other farmers and landowners who are very unhappy because their land is in the path of the pipeline and they don't want a pipeline going underneath of their property. And the Iowa Utilities Commission has granted eminent domain authority to Summit to be able to do that. And so there's just, it's a very interesting project because you have people who are normally aligned, farmers, agricultural producers who stand on different sides of the fence on that particular issue. But why we're talking about that here in the Big Beautiful Bill Act is just because the carbon sequestration credit would continue under this particular version. Now, there are some other things that some of our agricultural producers, like everybody else, have been able to also take advantage of in the last couple of years since 2022 that would be gone as well under this. And one of those is all of the home energy credits that were put in place by the Inflation Reduction Act or extended from prior law. Those are gone as well. So those would be ended in 2025 completely, which would be the first time that we really haven't had home energy credits available for quite some time. So that I think would be a provision that people should be aware of.
Really appreciate your time. Christine Tidgren is the director of the Iowa State University Center for Ag Law and Taxation. Thank you so much for joining us on Farm Here Daily.
Thank you for having me, David, and just remind people that we'll continue to write about this. You can check out our blog posts, and we'll talk about other impacts as well. There are agricultural provisions that are in here. Today, we just talked about tax provisions, but there are plenty of other provisions that I think are important for people to understand. So thank you.
Absolutely. And I want to mention, since you said that I definitely want to promote your guys' website, cult.iastate.edu, where you can see the blog posts and go more into detail of some of the aspects of the Big Beautiful Bill that we did not cover in our conversation today. So that is calt.iastate.edu. Is that right, Christine?
That's right.
Thanks, Christine. This is Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local Iowa content, we would love to have you join our community. Please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. Additionally, you can find me on social media at Geiger Reports, as well as WHO TV Channel 13 every weekday in their morning and noon hour programs. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.